Hello everyone and welcome. Mon nom est Nicole et je suis la présidente de l'Association des étudiants.
I'm the president of the International Students of Ottawa. I have the privilege to welcome you in our university to talk about the state of food security and nutrition in the world 2019.
I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. As many of us are settlers on this land, it is our collective responsibility to pay respect and recognize that this is the traditional, unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people. As we hold our discussions of food security in this space, it is important to reflect on what food security looks like in our own community. Le rapport de la FAO estime que
the FAO they know that there's a lot of people in the world that suffer from food insecurity. There's more than 2 billion people that do not have regular access to safe and nutritive food. So 8% in North America and Europe.
It's that indigenous populations around the world are often affected by poor food security and nutrition. They frequently live in extreme poverty and in environments that have been damaged, or they have lost their land and no longer have access to traditional food sources. As a result, they are particularly exposed to different types of shocks, including climate and economic shocks.
We're happy to collaborate to work with the IDRC and also the FAO, and we expect that the discussions will be fruitful.
The significance of having this event on a university campus today. It is vitally important to be engaging youth, whether that be students, young professionals, emerging researchers, or activists, in these conversations about innovative approaches and partnerships to address global challenges. With that in mind, I would like to welcome the MC of the event, Santiago Alba Corral, Director of the Agriculture and Environment Program area at IDRC, to provide welcome remarks and to go over the agenda of today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to the university and the students for having us today in your building. Please join us. The price is the same in the back than in the front. A couple of housekeeping. Nous avons la traduction simultanée.
We have simultaneous interpretation, so
if anyone needs, it's in the back, and we have our colleagues joining us. Also, for everybody to know, we are taking videos and pictures, and they will be posted in social media. So if you have any trouble with that, let us know, or I don't know how that works, probably leave the building or the planet these days. I want to welcome everybody to what is our 3rd event similar to this one. Some years ago, FAO and IDRC decided to join together to bring the SOFI report, the report that speaks about where we are in the state of food security, to Canada. And actually, FAO asked us not only to come to present, they asked us that they want to hear from Canadians, and from experts at different levels of the report. So how is it going to work? We are going to have 3 moments today, okay? And follow me on this one, because this is we are doing something new this year. We are going to have a first presentation, is a lecture where both Dominique Charon, the Vice President of International Programs in IDRC, is going to do some welcoming remarks explaining how this fits within IDRC. Then Bilendra from FAO, that is the representative of FAO for North America, coming from DC, is going to be presenting, doing a lecture on their report per se, trying to explain what is the main lessons that FAO is telling us this year. That's the first part. Then we move to a second moment, what is a panel. We have a panel of different experts that we've introduced later that are going to be giving their own opinion to different elements of the report. After that panel, we go to the 3rd component. And the 3rd component is a little bit new. Courtesy of FAO, we have kind of a cocktail model networking, so thank you for that. That is going to help us to have a networking roundtable discussion with everybody. So instead of having kind of questions and answers from the audience and not having time really to answer any of them, or we are going to go down, sit down everybody, we are going to realign the chairs in a different way, and we are going to have for an hour, or the time that we need, probably around an hour, a discussion, because expertise is around the building. So it's not only about the panel, it's not only about the speakers. So that's how it's going to be working. So don't leave if you see that we are moving from one to another. There's three things that you have to be: presentations, panel, and roundtable. Pardon me? All compulsory, exactly. So there's credits for all of them, and the third one actually has a cocktail, what is also even more interesting when you are in a campus, if I remember, many years ago. So with that, please, Dominique Charon, Vice President of Programs in IDRC, thank you.
Wow, bonjour tout le monde, bonjour tout le monde.
Hello, everyone.
So it's really a delight to be back here with all of you. Merci Santiago pour la.
Thank you, Santiago, for the nice presentation, and Nicole as well.
Vice President of Programs and Partnerships at Canada's International Development Research Centre, and I'm very pleased to be here today on behalf of IDRC as a partner for today's event with FAO and with the International Development and Globalization Student Association of the University. Thank you, Nicole, as well, for the acknowledgement upon whose land we are meeting. I think it's a key element in our traditions now going forward to think about this and to bring the Indigenous dimension of the challenges of food insecurity into the debate today. And I'm sure this will come out later throughout the discussions. So today, as you've heard, we are launching with FAO the report on the state of food security and nutrition in the world, the 2019 edition. Ce rapport souligne l'impact des...
This report shows the different economic problems, climatic extremes in some parts of the world, in a lot of places in the world, and how this will impede progress towards hunger reduction. We will talk about extreme poverty and increased inequalities that are really at the heart of what IDRC does.
Security and the food crisis being prolonged and worsened by economic shocks, the report advocates for comprehensive and scaled-up cross-sector action to foster pro-poor and inclusive structural economic transformation that integrates food security and nutrition concerns into poverty reduction efforts. We have 2 hours to sort that out, and then we'll be done, no? C'est un travail de longue haleine.
This is work that takes a lot of time.
That this be really inclusive transformation and ensures that gender equality is central to the efforts in addressing hunger and that no one is left behind. How do we achieve this transformation? If we had the answers, I don't think we'd need reports, and I don't think we'd need debates such as this. So this is our goal today. The panel that will follow in a little bit will highlight some of the challenges, opportunities, key issues that are moving in this sustainable, equitable, and healthy approach to thinking of food systems. Au CRDI, nous avons développé des programmes.
At IDRC, we have research programs that will answer innovations, challenges in order to increase food security in a context of a changing world. Farmers and agricultural communities are put first and foremost in the research. The Canadian International Food Security Research Fund is co-funded by Global Affairs Canada, allowed us to improve food security and food nutrition through research in order to touch 78 million people between 2009 and 2018.
Are not similarly affected by and able to respond to food insecurity. Gender is one of the key factors that determine vulnerability, response options, and resilience among populations facing interlinked global challenges. Research tells us that poverty and hunger have important gender dimensions, and we know this from the results of this program I alluded to a minute ago. And so women and men are facing hunger and all of the drivers of hunger in different ways. Access to resources and opportunities to cope are generally and frequently unequal. Households living in extreme poverty are more often than not now headed by women. Even when households have a male and female head, intra-household access to and consumption of food and other resources often favor men and boys over women and girls. And although climate change affects everyone, it has a greater impact on women and other groups that are marginalized or excluded or have differential access to resources and opportunities, Indigenous peoples, as we heard this, from Nicole, ethnic minorities, the poor more generally, and many other groups who face exclusion will be affected differently. The differences in vulnerabilities and exposure are not shaped simply by climate and environmental risks, but by factors such as discrimination and social cultural practices. And the report is getting at that in its model of forward growth model that is going to not only address hunger, but do it in a way that makes sure that all of these groups' needs are met. So it's important in our thinking about the future to go beyond the differences between men and women, to understand how other aspects of identity and exclusion contribute to this differentiated access, and to tackle the root causes of vulnerability and exclusion and take this kind of holistic approach. That's why we need research. That's why IDRC is still active in this space. And in particular, we are focused on strengthening the engagement and the capacities and the results of research in the developing regions of the world. In 2018, we launched the results of a call that was called Accelerating Climate Action, Social Equity and Empowerment of Women and Girls. Through this call, we will contribute new knowledge to this research and demonstrate what works on the ground to improve climate resilience and food security among women and other groups. This gender transformative approach is moving away from depicting women as powerless victims of climate and other shocks, and to focus on those structural power relations to enable that social transformation for improved resilience in the face of climate change and greater food security. C'est par exprès que nous tenons ce débat sur les...
This is why we have this food security debate here at the universities. You are the future researcher and practitioners in food security and climate changes. So solutions will come from you as well as from us. You are already acting on the global scale.
Security depend on new thinking and approaches that happen across sectors and that are taking a wider framing of the issue. And it seems an ever-widening framing of the issue. And this is, I think, the way that we can move forward now to really address these problems that are resisting solutions and persisting. They're the tough problems, they're the hard problems. Today's discussion with all of you is one key part of moving us forward in thinking in new ways about addressing food insecurity. And we thank the University of Ottawa's International Development and Globalization Student Association for their partnership in this. I look really looking forward to the discussion with the panel as well as the discussion later on. So without further ado, let me introduce Wimlendra Charan, who is the director of the FAO's Liaison Office for North America. Mr. Charan is a national of India, is an economist by training, holds an MBA from Birmingham, and has had considerable experience in different levels of government in India, including as Minister of Agriculture and alternate permanent representative to the Rome-based UN agencies. So we're very fortunate to have you with us in this capacity. Over to you to take us through the key findings of the report.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dominique and Nicole, for... Okay. Better? Thank you for that introduction. And I must confess that between the two of them, they have stolen my thunder. So I really don't know what to address and what to say. Youth has been covered. Indigenous people have been covered. Gender has been covered so beautifully. And those are the trouble spots. So thank you, IDRC, for co-hosting this with us. Thank you, University of Ottawa, and a big thank you to the International Development and Globalization Student Association, who I think are the main hosts for the event today. Speaking with students in the audience actually unnerves me a bit. I have two college-going children, both in Canada, by the way. One in McGill in Montreal and one in Toronto, doing their first year and final year now. Why it unnerves me is because that is where the most unnerving questions come from. So yesterday I was passing through Toronto and my son just turned around to me and said, "Oh, you're going to launch your failure." And it just set me thinking as to what exactly he meant by that. So he said, what else is this rising hunger other than failure? And it took me some time to really convince him as to why we need reports like this and why we need to come forth and make positive noise around these figures so that people understand what's going on, policymakers understand what's going on. And corrective action is initiated and taken. So for those of you who've been following SOFI from earlier days, from before it changed its nomenclature, it was SOFI, which was state of food insecurity in the world, and we would only talk of the negative, the food insecurity. Okay, thank you. So that changed in 2015. Earlier, this report was a joint report produced by the FAO, WFP, and IFAD, the three Rome-based UN agencies. But in 2016, WHO and UNICEF also joined. And that's how you find the report. The nomenclature has now changed to the state of food security and nutrition in the world. So we not only talk of the hunger figures now, but we also talk of what is happening in the nutrition arena. Because of the obvious linkage between both undernutrition and food insecurity. So we've just put this thing here just to explain the pathways which lead from food insecurity to malnutrition and undernutrition. You have the one pathway which is the undernutrition pathway, and you have the obesogenic pathway, both finally terminating in the same point, whether you take undernutrition as in children or you take malnutrition as in obesity, etc. for adults. So that's where the whole thing will lead up to. For the last 4 years, or rather 4 years back, we saw this uptake, and we called it an uptake, and we were not willing to call it a trend, because we really thought that this is an aberration, and for a decade hunger figures are falling, and that fall will continue, and this will remain an uptake and will go back on the declining graph. But sadly for us, for the last 4 years now, we find that this figure is not really showing a downward trend. Though in percentage terms it may have stabilized, but if you really look at it, it's stabilized at a 10.8%, which is really taking us back nearly 8-10 years. So even the stabilization in percentage term is at a very high level. In actual numbers, we seem to be going away from the SDG 2030 target of eliminating hunger and malnutrition. So the same figure, the same trend you'll find later in the presentation when we come to the nutrition aspects. Just a slide to show where these 821.6 million people are. Asia, Africa, they take the chunk. Asia in terms of number, Africa will take in terms of percentages. So this is how the distribution is. But that's not to say, as was mentioned by the earlier speakers, that this problem does not impact the developed world. It is quite predominantly maybe not that predominantly in the urban areas, but it is there in many parts of this country, in many parts of US, in many parts of other developed world. I'm told in USA, 45 million people are not really very sure of where their next meal is coming from. And that's just on the hunger side, but on the malnutrition side, obesity side, it's a major impact which we see in the developed world also. 3 years back when the report came out, we had identified drivers, and I think over the last 2 years we have presented the first 2 drivers, which is conflict and also climate change. This report goes on to talk about the third driver, which is the economic slowdown, downturn, and inequalities which impact. So with this report, we would be completing the analysis of the 3 drivers which were identified for the uptick that we see. So very quickly, I'll just show you 2 graphs. One which this gives you the conflict as a driver. So you'll find that both the prevalence and the number in conflict-afflicted countries of sub-Saharan Africa, they are higher than, they show more prominence than the numbers which you see for non-conflict countries. And a similar thing happens when you take the drought figures, when you find POU and NOU for both, for the sub-Saharan region being higher for those countries where drought is impacted. But what is interesting in coming out of this report now is also this figure which talks of the economic slowdown. And if you see the last 3 columns, they are now towering. So 2017, 18, 19, towards that, 16, 17, 18, 19, that's the time when economic slowdown starts hitting. And what is also interesting to note is that as the countries listed there, you'll find a lot of middle-income countries also being impacted. So it's not just the poor countries which are getting impacted, but a lot of it is in the middle-income countries, and that's something which we need to note. Again, something about the economic shocks. So you'll find here the high food prices, the currency depreciation, and unemployment. And these economic shocks, when they get combined with conflicts and climate and aspects there. If you look at the second last column at the far bottom, you'll see IPC 3 is that stage nearly 33.2 million people getting impacted. So wherever you have climate conflict and economic aspects all coming in together, you find that the people tending to go towards IPC phase 3 or phase 4 is much higher. That's something which policymakers need to understand well. This is just countries ordered from lowest to highest shared prosperity premium, and it gives the income inequality is rising everywhere. And the next slide, which is based on the Gini index or the Gini coefficient, also shows that countries where the Gini coefficient is high is where you are getting more protracted problems of food insecurity. For students who are not from maths, economics, Gini coefficient is a range from 0 to 1. 0, the higher the value, the worse is the inequality. So in a country where only one man owns everything, it will have a Gini coefficient of 1, whereas a country where everything is equally divided will have a Gini coefficient of 0. So more the inequality, higher the number. And again, you'll find that the problems in economic terms, it gets concentrated and it becomes more pronounced when we have inequalities in the economy. Now, I don't know how many of you have followed the news, but I think a couple of days back, the new IMF chief, Kristalina, who was earlier with the World Bank, in her first address itself, I think she's come out with this crazy figure saying that 90% of the countries worldwide are showing a slowdown. So going forward, it's going to, the IMF definitely has brought down the rate of growth for the globe as a whole, but 90% of the countries showing a economic slowdown is going to our mind, going to really impact the food situation in many of these countries. What came out from this report very clearly is that Hunger is increasing wherever you get an economic slowdown or downturn. Hunger is increasing in countries which we find are primarily dependent on import of primary goods, especially food items, and economic slowdown coupled with inequality in the distribution of income is also causing a major problem as far as hunger is concerned. So Kristalina goes on to call this synchronized slowdown of the world economy, with 90% of the countries showing a slowdown. What this report also deals with, and which is different from the earlier reports, is something about going beyond hunger, going beyond the figure of 821. So it's not just the severely hungry people who are a problem, the one in red, severe food insecurity, but it's also the moderate food insecurity which is impacting. So if you add up these two figures, I think you come to a figure of nearly 2 billion people. So nearly 1/3 or maybe now 1/4 of the globe is going hungry in one form or the other, and that is definitely having its impact on the world economy, also on the growth patterns in the world. The next slide is just a depiction of the various aspects. We've tried to capture that in one graph as to how the population is moving, how the number of people who are severely hungry, they're moving, how moderate hunger is moving, how poverty is moving in the world over these years. Now, what is interesting in this graph, if you've not already noticed, is that the World Bank is saying that the poverty figure is going down. So if the poverty figure is going down, why is the hunger figure going up? Now, that's a dilemma which can be answered in a very simple way also, but that's something which FAO, World Bank, and others are also looking at in much greater detail. And I think going forward, I think we will get to hear more about why this is happening, as to the poverty figures as described, but as comes out of the World Bank figures is going down, whereas the hunger figure coming from FAO show a increasing trend. This again is another graph showing how the distribution is of the food insecure countries, and you'll find Latin America and Africa taking the burden of most of the food insecure nations. We also find economic linkage here. So how does the total population, moderate or severe food insecurity, and the severe food insecurity move? Again, you'll find that the more you move towards the low-income countries, the red circle is becoming larger in proportion. So the economic development of a country is showing a direct correlation to severe food insecurity. So that's not to say that there's no food insecurity in high-income countries, as the first round of circles will show you, that even in the high-income countries you have severe food insecurity and moderate food insecurity, but in proportion terms they're much lower than what you'll find in the lower-income countries. Moving from there to nutrition, so we track nutrition on various parameters. So as I said in the beginning, the hunger is creeping up, moving away from 2030 sustainable development goals. And nearly the same is happening if you look at the nutrition figures. So you may find stunting and wasting there coming down, but at the rate at which it comes down, there's no way that we will achieve our targets by 2030. So if at those rates it comes down, maybe 2050, 2060 is where we achieve stunting and wasting, reduction in stunting and wasting. What is actually extremely disturbing is that many places we are moving away, we are actually going up. So if you look at obesity, for example, or you look at children overweight, you'll find, or you look at anemia, you'll find that we're actually going up. Forget going towards the target, forget meeting the target, we're actually going up. Especially of concern is obesity and overweight, which we find the rate at which they're increasing is even higher than the rate at which hunger is increasing. And that, again, as I said in the beginning, is not a first world phenomena, it's not a third world phenomena, it's a global phenomena. It has nearly nothing to do with how much you earn, because we find obesity a problem with poor households, we find obesity a problem with rich households. And there are different reasons for that. Somewhere you might be overeating, somewhere you might be eating cheap, bad food. both leading to obesity and both having its own consequences and trillions of dollars. So this is another aspect which needs to be kept in mind when we discuss food security and nutrition. This is a slide which will give you some overweight perspective figures. And the next slide is on prescribed policies to deal with obesity. Of course, these are well known, not practiced as well, neither at the policy level nor at the household level. But yes, Canada has taken a big step forward in talking about the good feeding habits and what you should eat every day and what you should not. But around the world, obesity has become a major curse, both in terms of food aspects as also in terms of the health aspect. So that's what the report really comes out with. It's a snapshot. 10 minutes is too little a time for really to go into the depths of the report. But this is the major findings. The three main drivers: conflict, climate, and economic slowdown. Economic slowdown coupled with economic inequality makes the problem worse. And we really need to talk about these figures. We really need to get to as many people as possible, because our firm thinking is that it's not rocket science to get over these problems. It's difficult, but not rocket science. The problem is, how much do we prioritize it? How much do the national governments prioritize it? And the more we talk to people, the more voices we build around this, I think that is extremely important. I'll just give one example and say thank you after that. And that is, it's amazing to understand that two plane crashes, MAX 8, the Boeing plane crash, which happened in the Indonesian Airlines, Lion Airlines, that killed about 150 people. It happened 10 years back, the Ethiopian Airlines, that killed about 180 people. So about 400 people died. What happened to Boeing MAX 8? I think we grounded it. There's not even one Boeing MAX flying it today. However, by the time this conference ends today, we would have seen perhaps about 1,000 children would have died. But yet, hunger and malnutrition is never grounded. For ages it's been there. We have the capacity to get over it, but we do not. And the reason, somewhere, I think we are missing on prioritizing the whole game. So especially with the youth and with the students who are sitting here, I think it's about time, irrespective of your discipline, irrespective of what you want to become in the world. You may become a doctor, engineer, or whatever. I think food is intrinsic to human living, and I think it's extremely important for all of us to be able to put a face behind each and every one of those 821 million people. Otherwise, it just remains a statistic. 821 can become 822 by the next report, or 823 by the next report. It won't make any difference if we do not start putting a face to that figure. So my sincere request to all of you is to start putting a face to that figure. The moment you do that, I think your perspective and your thinking about food security and malnutrition will change. And that is exactly why we have events like this. And that is what I told my son yesterday. Thank you.
So, of today's presentation, I am in mic. I am not in the mic. Apparently, I'm not in the mic. Thank you. They are not hearing me. You have me now? You have me now. Okay, perfect. Where I am. Yes. The panel. So we have three panelists that I want to be calling, and you have to sit in specific seats so that our colleagues in audio know where they are. Madiha Hamed, she's a senior program specialist in the Food, Environment and Health program with it. Oh my God, you're asking too many things at the same time, and I'm not multitask. What do I have to do? Thank you. Yeah, okay. Is that okay? No, but I have to do it. It's here. No, Madiha is an economist with the International Development Research Center with the Food, Environment and Health program. So thank you. We have Joanne Owens. Joanne is the head of Women's Economic Empowerment and Rights with CARE Canada. You sit there. Sorry, sounds very... We are friends from a long time ago. It does justify rudeness. So Joanne, thank you for joining us. We have Etienne Heiselin, who is a guest professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies in the University of Ottawa. Ça c'est parfait, merci Etienne. And we have Christopher Huggins, who is an assistant professor also in the School of International Development and Global Studies in University of Ottawa. And you feel free to tweet their comments as we follow the conversation. And I want to probably move a little bit this, even if I destroy some of the audio sound, because I want to hear and see all of you. I have a first question for all of you, and we can take it in this order. What resonates in the report? Is any aha moment? And also, what is missing? What you were expecting this year in the different areas that you work that you are missing? We can start with Etienne.
Okay, donc je vais parler français.
So I'm going to speak French. Does everyone have their headset on? Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm in 5 minutes. It's difficult to talk about everything in this report. Well, we know it is very rich. Every year there are more analyses with a very different and specific point of view. I know that 42 years ago there was the first FAO report in Montpellier. I was a student, and Edouard Saoudat was the director of the FAO, and he came to present the report in 1976. And I know things have changed over time. The aha moment for me was, well, it's when the FAO changed the way they did things. They dealt with hunger in one way, and now they changed. And today things are very different. The FAO now is talking about this issue of food safety in an integral way, and I think it's great. Until 2004, 2005, there were reports that still stipulated that said, look, this million of people suffer from hunger, and therefore we need to do this, and therefore invest. So that's what we need to note firstly. Things have changed. Second thing, the number of people, obese people, not overweight, but obese, has surpassed people who are suffer from malnutrition. So let's look at how we view things in our society vis-a-vis people who are obese and overweight. We don't think of them in the same way when it comes to people who suffer from malnutrition. So I think it's great that the FAO report talks about both these issues from the north and the south as both food insecurity issues. I know that a few years ago, talking about obesity, we also talked about malnutrition or undernutrition. Now we have a new index to describe this, which is very new, to talk about calories. And it's very difficult for the FAO to use all of these indexes because in one way we talk about all of this in a macro way, and we also talk about certain samples which are in very difficult situations. So as far as the method, I've got some questions about that, but the FAO has to look at all of these points together. And this report has been signed by many international organizations, and therefore oftentimes we talk about things that are working in silo, but now I think with this report, I think they have changed everything. Now, what is not in this report? So let me go quickly here. They haven't gone far enough when it comes to certain policies. Yes, of course, when you talk about policies, the FAO is a multilateral organization that begins to tremble, but they will not be able to overcome this issue until they deal with political issues, and this also includes research issues. What are the mechanisms, political mechanisms, that lead us to issues these situations? So what are the asymmetric situations? We talk about obesity, of course, and we're talking about multinationals that have these POP. So let's talk about these issues. You can't escape that. So that is what's not in this report. when you read this report, which is well done, obviously if there aren't civil society, researchers, and all these people who are making a huge effort to make a political analysis of the situation, well, things won't change. We will not be able to change the situation, this awful situation that we are experiencing today, and we will not succeed. Now, some 70 years ago, we talked about the right to food, and this was 70 years ago. So we have a lot of work to do, but I still like to congratulate the FAO for the work, the great work they have done every year now, and in October we know that I have been following this for many years, and I'm very happy. We will talk about the economy's role and policies a little bit later. Maliha, would you like to say something?
I'm going to echo a lot of what Etienne said, that this is a very rich report, and in particular, the way that it summarizes a lot of very complex issues. So for me, again, given where I work, the term "we need to transform food environments," that of course resonates very strongly with me, and the way that they lay that out, because we speak about households and we speak about structures, but in the end, a lot of what food is consumed at what price point and where really matters at where we find food and where that interacts. So how that is structured around our school environments, our home environments, our office environments, whether we're in urban structures or we're in rural structures. And the structure of what is available really does govern what all of us in this room, and the report really talks about the accessibility and affordability of food and what it takes to transform that, why we are in a particular place and certain options are available at certain prices, and how we can, or how policies, regulations, etc. can actually help transform that so that we shift towards an affordable, accessible, healthy diet. The second part of that is of course, this is FAO and the work that they do is the multi-sectoral approach. This is not just about food and food production. If what we're looking for is health outcomes and also improving access and affordability for households and reducing hunger, it is not something that just increasing food supply will change. It is about access, about people's incomes, people's control over what they can do, and so the range of actors that need to be involved is everything from municipal governments to health to, frankly, our economic policies and fiscal policies. So the report really does touch on that really well. And finally, and we talked quite a bit about that in the last bit, is about the complex interaction between economic growth and insecurity. And I do want to say that the report does that, especially unpacks that really well, because it talks about the mechanisms and the underlying drivers, and it does not say that growth is equal to or will get us to food security, but rather that we need to understand the economic mechanisms, and a lot of that is actually down to choice. What we choose to prioritize. Do we center households and people in terms of the outcomes that we want and the policies that are implemented? This is not something that is objectively determined or determined outside by rules that do not understand, that are not linked to results. So it matters what the trend in oil prices are, but a lot of that, how that affects a particular economy, depends on whether it's a food producer or a food importer. We look at the effect of environmental crisis, again, on different countries, depending on whether they're producing cereals or they're importing cereals. And then the choices of protecting people and households from food insecurity in respect to adequate social protection, and in terms of protecting them from unemployment, low income, crisis shocks. These are things that are not automatically built into any economy, and we have to make conscious choices to support them with that. What I do find missing a little in this is the household inequality and gender at the household level is very well explained, but when we talk about structures, again, our choice of economic policy, back to, I think, Etienne's comment of we have to talk about political choices. Food systems overall are gendered. It's not just about households, intra-household decision about who gets food and how, who benefits from food, or who has to bear the burden of the coping mechanism when there is inadequate food. But in terms of who is involved in the process, who produces the food, who makes decision about it, and it's still heavily gendered. And the impact of this at the structural level, so in terms of policies such as social protection policies, that's also heavily gendered. If we're going to make the decision making in a silo which is looking at just how much tax is collected or who benefits from that, that's not the same as that ignores the effect on households. So we cannot support the two. And the report talks very well about the household effect, but the larger connections between the economic, macroeconomic policy choices we make and the effects at the household level also need to be looked at.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marika, on that one. Etienne, your time. Go, Etienne, Chris.
No problem. Okay, I think, this report is an amazing resource. The amount of data, especially quantitative data that's analyzed, that's crunched over at least a 10-year, 15-year time frame is an incredible resource to use. Something that struck me, and it's kind of a piece of good news, is the coverage quite in some depth around the food price crisis, which hit 2008 and then again 2011. There were global spikes in food prices. And at the time, it was reported that this actually pushed a lot of people into food insecurity, and that this was a driver of increasing poverty at the time. And the World Bank and other major multilateral organizations were kind of arguing this point. However, in this report, it actually finds that low-income countries where food insecurity is a major problem, actually managed to put in place policies to deal with that, and it contradicts. You saw in the data there in the chart, the proportion of food insecure people continue to decline, over that period. So for me, first of all, that's good news that countries do have agency within the global political economy. Even faced with these market-based challenges, they can put in place these policies. It also does show me that this kind of long-term analysis is really important, and we should be careful about kind of miracle, countries which are seen to miraculously emerge from poverty or from food insecurity, sometimes over the medium to long term. That's shown to be more complicated. It also, I think, shows that there are, if you like, tensions in the analysis, and it's not just about putting forward, the same old statistics. Really, there are important debates we need to have over policies, over these kind of impacts. I'm going to follow up a little bit. This is the problem with being third or fourth. You're always following other people's comments. I think in a report like this, and this is not a criticism, again, it's a very macroeconomic report. It goes into a lot of policy analysis, but it is really doing this hard work of crunching this data. Sometimes it seems as if the policies that we're talking about kind of come from above, right? They come from governments. They come from policy kind of think tanks. But I think following on from this example of this global food crisis, what we do know that happened around that time was that citizens, especially poor people, poor urban people, underemployed, jobless people, were on the streets demonstrating and quite often rioting, right? So I think we can't just say that governments put in place policies to defend their economic systems from price rises. They are forced to do so by citizens rising up and demanding their rights. As Etienne also said, the right to food, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think collective action was quite rightly mentioned as key to overcoming some of these kinds of challenges. And while part of that comes from, I think, high-level politics. And another kind of, again, not so much a gap, but something we might talk about is the role of, for example, regional economic blocs in kind of mediating some of these trade and other kind of aid policies as well, kind of making sure that countries aren't undermining food security with their neighbors when they're putting in place, for example, protectionist kind of policies. So there's politics at the high level, you know, through these kind of collective agreements at the regional level, but also, you know, the role of farmers' unions. Obviously, with the FIAP and heading into election time, I have to mention women's organizations and the important role of women's organizations. So I think, yeah, just kind of tracing some of the political economy of the institutionalized collective action that can make a difference both at the local level and at the high level as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Joanne, you're last. Do you have anything more? Or is
I was concerned about going first, and now I'm thinking last wasn't so good. So I'm not a researcher. I'm a development practitioner, and for me, looking at a document like this, partly it's to kind of like validate the work or the direction we're going. Is this the trends that we've been seeing? Is this what we're doing? And so in terms of, I'm not sure so much it's a aha, but it's kind of like, yeah, we can kind of see this coming. I do as well as mention that, like, the evolution of the document over time and how it's getting into a little bit looking at more of the factors that are having an impact on food security and on nutrition. And one of the gaps, though, that I found for me going through this was actually with respect to gender, and it although it does it talks to it, and it speaks to the importance of reducing gender inequalities and social exclusion. It even goes as far as to say that it has to be the means to or the outcome of food security and nutrition. But the data is not speaking to that. The data is at a much higher level, and when it's talking about inequality, it's talking about rich people and poor people. It's the inequalities are at a much macro scale and not speaking specifically to those very specific vulnerabilities at a household level. And so I'm talking about gender inequalities. I'm talking about the very specific impact of, like, if you're looking at a higher at the stunting levels, you know, what is the difference in boy child and girl child? If we're looking at household income, what is the difference between the women and men? Because even in those differences, there are major differences, and that's just men and women. As Dominique mentioned earlier, we do have to start looking at greater vulnerabilities and looking at it way more holistically in terms of ethnic minorities, the seniors, like elderly, young, people with disabilities, like religious minorities, etc. So that was whereas I was hoping to see a lot more in terms of that. It doesn't ignore it, and it does speak to it being important. But I look to you as researchers and future people doing these things. Your data needs to be complete, and you need to speak to it. And maybe it's there, but then you also have to talk about it and show it. Otherwise, people like me can't do our work very well.
Thank you, Joanne. And actually, since you were the last one, I went to jump on this one because there's one reason why this panel is in this way. It's not like we know aleatory people and we bring in here. It's because we wanted to have the whole perspective. We are going to go in the second question to understand what is happening at the household level, what is happening when we implement policies and programs. And we are going to see what is happening at the level of economics and policies that actually allow or block those developments. And also the role of research in influencing, informing, and changing those aspects and the future. And actually the fourth panel is bringing a little bit of this continuum of the whole complexity around food security. And that's why I want to start with you. Because we want to start from the ground, and because not only you are a practitioner, you're actually coming back from one of the extreme trainings in humanitarian response for the last week. What works? What are the reality at the household level? What are the gender aspects? What are the elements that make possible that those trends change? And in particular, I want to ask you a little bit as well, if you can tell us about that continuum, not anymore a continuum, but a reality of development and conflict that used to be so divided in previous analysis. We used to look at the food aid of the WFP responding to food emergencies, and now development. You actually are having programs that goes looking at economic development, the food security, gender equality in those spaces of conflict and development. So how does this look like in the ground, Joanne?
All right, I'm going to give this a go, and if you can just prod me if I've missed something.
We have a 5 minute sign.
Okay, so what works, or what makes it work at the field level, and so doing a gender analysis, I'm going to speak to. I'll speak to it in that sense. I'm also I'm head of women's economic empowerment. It's kind of what I have to do, and rights, but looking. Yeah, doing a gender analysis and seeing what exactly are the specific impacts of whatever intervention it is, because it really does significantly make a difference. So if you're looking at, I'll take examples of certain projects. Farming tools. So if we're looking at in the Philippines recently, Typhoon Haiyan, and looking at tools to do abaca stripping, and I can talk about what abaca is and what it is not after when we socialize around the cocktails, but. They looked at what was preventing the women from being able to make the same sort of income or a better income than what there were. And it's the tools were too heavy, the tools were awkward, they couldn't carry the tools up mountains, they can't do cassava chipping, and so designing tools that are proper for the use of the women. Like it sounds really, really tiny and simple, but massively has a huge impact. It has a huge impact on the women in those households, the money they're able to bring in. Working also at what are the social norms in the community? What are the norms that women for women and men? What are the expectations of it? And changing and working on what those dynamics are at the household level, so that now men are maybe taking more time or working, doing more of the household chores, so eliminating some of the time burden on women, which also allows them to participate more economically. And some of the things that are discussed in the report are the ability, like the household income. Well, those are things that are specifically look at the overall household income of men and women. And in the case in the Philippines, again, it meant that men did not have to leave the country to find additional labor, or in cases other women leaving the country, because then they were able to stay home, stay in their communities. Another strong thing that from CARE's experience, our VSLAs, Village Savings and Loans. In French, that's the Association Villageoise d'Épargne et Crédit. And so these are groups that bring, these are formations of groups of primarily women in most of the countries we're working with, but also of men as well, where they will gather together and do small savings on a weekly basis. And this is helping them in cases of the drought in Ethiopia, where the members of VSLAs didn't have to sell off all of their assets to be able to survive, because they had some small savings, because they were able to purchase grains when they were less expensive and stockpile, because they were able to do some things. It made them far more resilient to the shocks, the economic shocks, the climate shocks, and conflict as well. Now, on the conflict end, I would say there's still a lot more work and a lot more research that needs to be done in terms of how not to lose all of the gains that we might have made, because that can last for a certain period. But what happens to those VSLA groups when you have mass migration, when you've had, when because of conflict, people have had to leave? And so, and there are solutions. There's some tech solutions too in terms of how to keep that social cohesion at a virtual level. But again, that doesn't work absolutely everywhere. So there's still a lot more research that needs to be done to look at how on prolonged stress, how to keep that going, how to maintain that social cohesion. But I'm going to come right back to the beginning again. it doesn't matter what your solution is if you are not looking at men and women and the impact on both, then your solution's not any good.
Thank you, Joanne. Madhika, the team of the Food Environmental Health within IDRC has worked a lot on understanding the policies and economics. So we know what is happening at the household level, but that doesn't really reach the next level of, you said, of healthy foods that actually create. What you have learned in this period, what needs to happen, and can you give us some examples of what is working?
So just for context, in the Food, Environment and Health team, we work on improving access and affordability of healthy diets as part of prevention of obesity and non-communicable diseases. One of the absolutely fantastic bits about working within IDRC is that we can support researchers in their specific country context to prioritize their specific needs and work within their community to resolve that. And what we support is research, because there are two parts of that. One is understanding what's going on, and then being able to explain that to agents of change, which a lot of what we work is at the policy level and the national policy level for change, but there are a whole lot of other actors, including communities. So in terms of examples, for instance, we talk at the policy level, and I'm going to speak about generalities, but I think the report makes a good point about it is very specific to the context, so I can't say this one thing will work everywhere. So around things like, for instance, how economic policy interacts with your particular economic context and how that can improve access to healthy food. So, for instance, the rules around sugar in your food or in your sweetened beverages, or level of sodium, and all, just using government policy to set the rule of the game, or at least to restrict dangerous or unhealthy products that are available, and not downloading that responsibility to each individual person in a household, but rather managing that as a society. And that has worked really well. And again, we've worked with the researchers in several countries around the world to test that policy, see how well it works, what is the scale of change that happens, how does the market transform, so the people who produce particular products, how do they respond to that? So it's very context specific. The second part of what we work on is coalition building, because again, a lot of what we work on, or our researchers work on, is the understanding what a policy should be, testing it out and reporting back, but change does not just come within government buildings. So that coalition building is really necessary for transformation. So a lot of our researchers, for instance, in Ecuador, they're working at in these on responsible food consumption. So they're working with consumer and producer organizations, and it's really ambitious. They're looking to invest 5% of their population's food budget on healthy food. So how can you get that scale of change by involving all of those who are working in the system? What is the evidence that is needed to see how that change happens and where that change happens? And part of that is being able to understand the leverage points in the food system. So a lot of that, for instance, some of our work, and this is as diverse as places in Bangladesh, where you're understanding what the distribution of overweight and obesity is between men and women. So in Bangladesh, for instance, we've had partners such as the Center for National Resource Studies who've looked at the differences across urban and rural areas, and what they see is that increasing urbanization is reducing the level of underweight trends, but increasing overweight. But malnutrition burden is also shifting. And you can't assume that rural areas are actually better nourished, because it goes back to being able to unpack what is actually happening, what is the trend at the household level. And you can see that women are more likely to be underweight and men overweight, but this is very different in Kenya, for instance, or Ghana, where you have a very different pattern. So that's why it is really important to unpack that, and our researchers do that work in their context. So then when they work on the solutions and they test it and they work with change makers, they're able to design something effective, and if it's not, they're able to assess that and incorporate that change as it goes along. I can talk more, but perhaps I should stop.
No, just keep it for later. Chris, there's another layer right now, the role and potential and power of research, actually as a tool of change. We talk about participatory action research, but really the research that engage in giving solutions to today's problems of farmers and poor communities. What is your experience in that area and the role that research can play on changing the game?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I'll speak, I guess, to the report, but from my own experience, as you say. So my own research experience is exclusively in sub-Saharan Africa, and especially East Africa and a little bit Southern and Central Africa. And I want to kind of highlight again this issue of, there are things that we don't understand well, or there are persistent kinds of myths. So, while there are figures which we know are true, there are other things which really do need to be unpacked. So I think one thing I really love about this report is that it recognizes very clearly that GDP growth does not necessarily result in reduced levels of poverty or reduced levels of food insecurity, right? So it really does insist on inclusive growth. And I think the report does include lots and lots of good examples of policies which can be put in place to diversify economic growth and places where governments can invest. But the devil, of course, is in the details, right? We have to kind of understand what is going on. And just briefly as an example of how detailed kind of qualitative field research is important, in Africa, the African Union has put forward the CADEP, the Comprehensive Agricultural African Development Program, which kind of requires all countries who sign on to this to put, I think, 10% of their annual budget towards agriculture. It's a great goal, and of course, many organizations, push and promote that goal. But where is that money going, right? So I think one of the things that does not come out very clearly from this report, again, because it's already tackling a lot of issues, is a big debate, and probably it's more relevant to the last year's report on climate impact, etc. But it's around the role of organic agriculture, kind of agroecological models. Are we advocating that farmers, again, focusing on low-income communities in places like sub-Saharan Africa, are we advocating that they are given subsidies for fertilizers, artificial fertilizers? Are we advocating that they get access to seeds, whether it's hybrid seeds or GMO seeds? Are we kind of looking at this as an extension of the Green Revolution, or are we looking at other kinds of options? And I think that this report makes a great point about also commodity-dependent economies, so economies which are seen as rising stars in the global economy, but are heavily dependent on oil and gas, or minerals, for example, or timber, and just haven't been able to create jobs, particularly in rural areas, because of the limited nature of job creation within these sectors. So I think, thinking about that, looking at how some of these investments are made. So, you have a country where there's a lot of money generated from oil and gas, for example. The money is largely captured by elites in the capital city. How then is it put into rural areas? How then is it invested in agriculture? And there's a few kind of traps, I think, which governments can fall into. One of which is kind of a modernization trap. They assume that development looks a certain way. They prioritize kind of formal institutions. They prioritize possibly white elephant projects, which kind of are very visible, high status projects, but might not really deliver in terms of pro-poor growth. And there's also this kind of failure, I think, to integrate climate change fully into planning and really give farmers, for example, or pastoralists, the kind of freedom and the kind of package of the kind of menu of options to make their own choices, to adapt and to use all the buzzwords to become more resilient. It's very hard for a government, I think, to provide a lot of money, for example, to the agricultural sector without doing it in quite a top-down kind of imposed way. So how do we provide farmers with autonomy within also these kinds of farmers unions or women's, the village savings organizations you were talking about are a great example. So how can they be really, again, using a buzzword, how can they really be empowered to influence policy as well as just being recipients of government aid or other forms of aid? So obviously there's much more we can say about that. It's a big topic, but I'll leave it there in the interest of time.
Good. Étienne, tu es toujours le directeur de stratégie et de la recherche.
You're the Director of Strategy and Research, the CIRAD. This is the Center for International Cooperation for Development. It's in Montpellier. And you worked a lot on the future. So what are the challenges for the food system? It wasn't the question that you asked me at the beginning, but I think this one is more interesting. First of all, you have to recognize that we should talk about a food system rather than production. But it makes problems even more complex. The food system, I will remind you that agriculture is the first job in the world. It's 1.6 billion people in the world are farmers. The second sector after that is the car industry, which has 50 million jobs. So agriculture is 32 times more than the automobile sector. This is very important to remember. In the food system, you don't have only producers, but there's also other players, and these have distinct interests. For instance, with coffee, maybe we have 15 million coffee producers, but there are 3 buyers that decide on prices. So this is a very big difference in the power of these people. Also, food systems is not just to produce food and to consume it. The producer, processor, distributor, consumer, and even what happens inside your own body. You have to integrate all this. This is a big factor in food security. These systems provide food, but they also provide jobs. And when you see, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, they will go from 1 billion to 2 billion people. So producers will have to increase. Even Africa is big. You have to find jobs right now. It's much better to find agriculture that will provide jobs rather than just providing food. So in the countries where there's extreme poverty, this is the most important thing, jobs. Second thing, how do we find this systemic transformation? We do not take the global approach that FAO took. At the level of the households, men, women, kids, babies do not have the same kind of status when access to food is concerned. But when we talk about systemic changes in agriculture, we have to take into account the local context. I'm repeating what has already been said. There are problems that are due to global injustice, but analysis and understanding can only be reached if we consider the local and territorial level. We have a set of players that can make decisions. And this means that if you go to Chad, you will not have the same kind of resilience and the same constraints and challenges that if you go to regular farming in Nigeria. There's nomads and there's sedentary people. It's different. So research, it can choose 2 ways. You can be contemplative, and it's a bit pejorative, but to try understand, to write, to understand all these mechanisms, and then you can choose to be centered on solutions. You work with producers, you work towards solutions, innovations, vaccines, and so on. But most of the time, these solutions are in the local context. This is for people who have very little capacities. These innovations have to be low tech because it's the players that are important. So when you choose equity in the food system, this goes to innovation. It really depends on the context. And researchers should not prescribe a system and says you have to plant such and such a thing and put chemicals on your field. But it's a great challenge because you have one researcher in France for 100 producers. There's one researcher for 100,000 farmers in Burkina Faso. So you cannot say, I will find the solution that will be the solution for everyone.
It's the same one for all of you. We have the opportunity. We are facing probably the people that are going to be in these seats in probably 3, 5, 10 years from now and going to Rome as representative of the Canadian government and FAO and being in heads of economic development at CARES or in IDRC. The question for us to them, or vice versa, is what do we need? How do we equip ourselves for the challenges that are challenges of today, challenges of tomorrow? The trends that we have seen are not going to be solved probably in 5 years. We have horizons of 5, 10, 25 years, but still we are facing continued changes. What is the advice? What is missing? What do we need to put in place so that the next generation, when it takes our jobs, they can end the job that apparently there are some things that we are not doing? And you can take it as if anyone has an idea, you can start there.
Well, I'm going to start with a very, very narrow question that path dependency. So we're talking about top-down and the impulse to do things, well, we'll set this out and we'll set the rules of the games, and that's the way economic policy functions, and then things will flow from there. But sometimes we have to really shift the rules of the game. And in a very narrow way, I want to talk about one thing that comes up quite a lot in the report, actually. The link between rising, in several countries, this is not for every country, but several countries, link between rising oil prices and transportation costs and the shock that bears to food prices. And then, of course, then the secondary effects on particularly vulnerable households, the economic shocks, and then income shocks, etc., and the effects that has. But that presupposes that we're not going to change the system. We're not going to have, that presupposes that our transport system and our distribution system and our economies are continuing to be oil-driven. What happens when that changes? Can that change happen in a way that involves the people who are part of the system rather than, again, being top-down, so they can be part and parcel of that change and benefit from that shift? And where is that investment coming from? Because a lot of our challenges between smallholder farmers versus large farmers is who bears that upfront cost of change. So changing path dependency is necessary, that's where we are, but who bears that cost, and are we willing and able and ambitious enough, have the foresight enough to do that? And I think a second part of that for me is at scale. We talk about, it's not just food producers, but the food system currently, there's a lot of processing involved. And some of that, in some of the ways when we look at the food environment, we look at it in a healthy, unhealthy way. Additives, etc. It's low cost, it's pervasive, but low nutrition. But we are going to be feeding a lot of people. What is the way to shift that low cost but low nutrition to low cost but high nutritional value in a way that's not just about simply growing food, but that processing bit is part and parcel of our modern food system? What does that take? And again, in that shift, who benefits? I'm going to stop there. There are other aspects of this that might be really interesting, but I'm hoping people will take that on.
Sure. I'll mention something which might seem niche, but I'll try and contextualize it a little bit more. Talking about, for example, agriculture, but it could also be fisheries. One of the ways in which we can ensure that growth is inclusive is by having products which are kind of value-added, products which are organic, products which have been ethically produced, products like in fisheries which are guaranteed free of kind of forced labor and sustainable products, environmentally sustainable products. So of course we have systems in place, certification systems, fair trade, ethically sourced certification systems in place. And I think, looking at the future kind of generations, people are more and more aware of the importance of these dimensions of food production. At the same time, we're living in an epoch where it's more and more kind of winner takes all politics at the international level, in terms of solidarity between countries, in terms of solidarity between citizens. I think things seem grimmer and grimmer in terms of the global politics, and these kind of certification schemes could be undermined through the broader kind of political climate, but also through something which I think, Etienne, you mentioned, the kind of, or you hinted at least, the global vertical integration of value chains, big buyers kind of controlling, essentially, commodity chains for certain goods. What they have done is quite often just undermine certification systems. You have, this is one example, Starbucks, which has its own kind of ethically sourced system, which ignores the kind of fair trade label and seeks to kind of undermine some of the more independent forms of certification. So that's just one example. How do we, as concerned consumers, support these kinds of certification systems, even as global corporate power are undermining them, are telling us, no, it's okay, you can go with our systems, even though they might not be as independent and as ethical as the systems which are in place. So how do we, I think, continue to make sure that people have the knowledge? This is certainly a place for research, detailed research. And how do we ensure that these certification systems that are putting more money in farmers' pockets, or ensuring that there's no modern-day slavery in the fisheries sector, how do we ensure that those are kind of, again, regulated and we can believe in them, we believe that they're real. At the same time, we don't be so cynical that we let the whole idea of fair trade and ethically, sustainably traded agricultural commodities or fisheries, etc., just become undermined by consumer cynicism. Again, I'll leave it there in the interest of time.
Okay. Joanne?
All right. Okay, so basically everything that they said and are going to say, but when you get to it, when you're doing your research, or when you're whether you're a researcher or practitioner, put on your gender lens. This is and your rights lens. This is a question. This is a question of rights. It is a question of equality and a challenge of inequality. Any interventions that don't do that are either going to entrench existing inequalities, or just make it that much worse. And so and that's when it comes to any intervention or research question that you're looking at. The change has to be transformational. And so it's not lip service. I think Dominic mentioned that as well. It's not just a question of counting numbers of women and men, but the change does have to be transformational. And in CARE's language, we're looking at agency, relations, and structure. And so, the voice, the relationships, the social cohesions, and then the policy level, or that structure at the very, very high levels, international, national, all the way through to community and family relations of how that has to change. And I can talk for days and days and days about that. So
we don't have days and days.
So I will leave it at that. But just to follow on something that Chris is mentioning in terms of consumption and value chains, there's also something you can do today and every day going forward is paying attention to what you are consuming. You have a power in every penny you spend or not spend.
Thank you. And we will have we don't have days, but we have a full hour to discuss in detail some of these questions. Etienne, le dernier mot.
Oui, donc comme Johan, je pourrais parler.
Johan was saying I could speak about this for a long time, but I'll say two things. Science and research's role in all of this, and researchers, and their legitimacy in finding solutions. Firstly, we are not legitimate to intervene in cultures in countries which are not ours. The IDRC has a partnership which is fundamental, and without this partnership we will not be able to move forward until there is scientific proof within these countries who have to face these challenges. The research's role, like the IDRC, is a capacity building, amongst other things. Secondly, now something for the young researchers or practitioners. Well, be curious when it comes to changes and reality. For research for publication has no sense to it whatsoever. You have to publicize, I understand that, but research for change is logical. So be careful with what leads to change and who will be involved. When you publicize an article in a great journal, which is specialized, well, you'll have it'll be very good for you, good for your CV, but it is not logical when it comes to the urgency of today's issues. So be curious when it comes to the changes that you can spark. And I once told a colleague that go against conventional ideas. Don't just accept them. For 30 years of my career, I was satisfied with a blindness. And I was working without taking into account people's opinions until a colonel colleague published an article on children's nutrition in Malawi. And she looked at as many investigations of how households were working, and the variable that she covered was that the husband and wife spoke together at night before going to sleep. That was the variable that was included. Now, this is going against a accepted idea. What you have to do is by doing conducting these type of research projects. Now, to finish, I'd like to say that we have a duty as researchers to become part of coalitions. There are 30 million people who took to the streets and said, look what science is saying. Why don't we form coalitions amongst the civil society, scientists, political people, and companies even, because companies want things to move forward. Thank you, Etienne.
Thank you so much to our panelists. But I want to change one thing on our agenda because we are running out of time and batteries apparently because we are talking too much. I'm not going to take questions and answers for the audience, and I want to ask you to take all your questions to the discussion that we are going to have in a bigger group. And we have more time then to go into detail and deep in some of the comments that I hope are getting in your mind, because at least some of are in mind. And I want to ask Tom Pesek, a senior liaison officer and FAO in DC, to tell us what you have here from us as you happily has been listening and taking notes of the Canadian perspective from Sophie. And we used to have a night that has disappeared.
I can give you mine.
This is because I stand between everyone and church. No one wants to hear from me.
Take it out.
Can you hear me? So it's funny, I'm like Wim Lenger, based in Washington, and before coming here, some of my Canadian friends and colleagues cautioned me that no one in Ottawa would want to talk politics given the upcoming elections, but I think our panelists must not have gotten the memo because politics is all they wanted to. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'll do my best to try to unpack some of what we've heard and try to connect some of the dots between what we've heard. First, we heard from Nicole, who very warmly welcomed all of us here and reminded us of where we are and whose land historically we're on, so context is important. We then heard from Dominique Chiron of IDRC, who underscored the critical need to address the challenges faced by particularly vulnerable, marginalized, and disempowered groups, especially women. She emphasized the need to tackle the politics of identity and exclusion in order to promote a resilient future for all. And lastly, she highlighted the critical importance of research in advancing this agenda. We then heard from my FAO colleague, Vimlendra Sharan, who presented the key findings of the SOFI 2019 report, noting that for the fourth consecutive year, global hunger has increased, and that we now have some 820 million people around the world who are hungry, which reverses nearly a decade of progress in reducing hunger. And he noted that the key drivers of this increased hunger are conflict and protracted crises, climate change, and economic downturns and slowdowns. He also noted that in terms of achieving our global goal of ending hunger by 2030, that we're very much off track. In fact, we're not just off track, we're headed in the wrong direction. And then lastly, Vimlendra called upon all of us to once and for all ground hunger, to put a face to the 820 million persons around the world who suffer from hunger. We then heard from Etienne, who commended FAO for its treatment of soaring obesity and overweight in the SOFI report, but he called upon FAO to deal with some of the political issues that are driving these trends. He stressed the need to consider all actors in the food system and their potential role in transforming it. We then heard from Adia, who talked about how policies and regulations can serve as vehicles for promoting healthy diets and nutrition, and she stressed the need to understand and address the complex interaction between economic growth and food insecurity. She noted that FAO should definitely look at the macroeconomic policies and their effects on food security at the household level. We then heard from Chris, who noted that long-term analysis is important in considering especially the food price crisis and the evolution of things since then. And he also emphasized the importance of considering political economy and the role of regional economic blocs in undermining food security among neighbors. He also highlighted the important focus of the report on inclusive growth. And then we heard from Joanne, who highlighted the gaps with respect to gender inequalities in the report, such as comparing stunting rates between boys and girls, men and women, and noted that data and analysis need to be complete. And then lastly, she underscored the importance of conducting a gender analysis to understand the impact of specific interventions. So I think we've heard some pretty sobering news here and some sobering analysis, but I'd just like to emphasize that it's not all gloom and doom. All is not lost. I think that in considering the challenges before us, there are three particular things that give me hope. The first is that in thinking about the big global challenges that we face, I think the solutions to all, or at least most of them, are very much connected. For instance, if we take steps to fix our broken global food system, we'll not just reduce hunger, but we'll reduce malnutrition, we'll reduce poverty, we'll reduce or prevent climate change, as well as inequality. The second thing that gives me hope is knowing that we already know the solutions to these challenges, that we already have the knowledge and the technologies and the practices we need to solve these problems. But getting back to politics, what we lack is sufficient political will to act. And then lastly, all of you give me hope. I think it's very fitting that we're here having this discussion at the University of Ottawa with so many students, because all of you are our future leaders and are really the ones who are going to have to take forward this work. And your engagement and commitment gives me hope that you're up to the task. Thanks.